How is the theme of power presented in J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls? Let's find out. Hello Revision Squad, how's it going? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video I'm going to discuss how the theme of power is presented in J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls. So in this video I will cover what I mean by the theme of power, analyse some quotations that are relevant to it, and I will even discuss why Priestley might have made it a theme of his play. It's worth remembering that discussing an author's possible intentions could contribute towards you achieving the top grades, so don't miss out on that section of the video. Make sure that you have got a pen and some paper out in front of you. That way you can take notes of the things that I say over the course of the video, as most of them won't be appearing on screen. Please do not forget to like, comment and subscribe if this video helps you out, as that helps me out loads too. So I've told you that this video is going to be about the theme of power, but what does that actually mean? So it's actually really weirdly difficult to summarize power without using the word power. But you could say that it is the ability to influence other people or events. Or you could say that it is having and maintaining control, which could be control over people, events, or a situation. Of course, in this play, power is intrinsically connected to gender, age, class, wealth, and status. In particular, upper-class male homeowners would have had the most power, and the further away from this ideal you are, the less power you have. It's also worth thinking that power is also related to some of the characters' professions. The inspector will have power because he is a police inspector, and Mr. Birling will have power as a business owner. Of course, your exam paper might not use the word power. Instead, it could use authority, control, or even dominance. So hopefully that has given you a good idea about what I mean when I say the theme of power. Now let's have a look at how it manifests itself across the play. Before we look at specific quotations in detail, I thought I would give you a quick bit of generic analysis. On screen right now, we have a dash. J.B. Priestley uses dashes throughout his play for a number of different purposes, but the type of dash that I would like to talk about is the dash that appears at the end of a character's dialogue, often when they are midway through a sentence. This dash indicates that the next character to speak is in fact interrupting the character whose dialogue ends with the dash. This does indicate power, as the second character is cutting short the first character's dialogue, which implies that they want to shut them down, or that they think that what they have to say is more important or significant. Preventing another character from speaking is one way of controlling them, and shows a certain degree of dominance in a conversation. In fact, speaking of conversations and dominance, you could also think about conversational dominance, a phrase that literally means dominating a conversation. This obviously manifests itself in the use of interruptions in dialogue, but it is also apparent in the use of questions too. If a character asks lots of questions, it means that they are in charge of a conversation's topic, and so they are steering it to their interests or agenda. You could also consider the frequency of utterances across a stretch of dialogue. If a character speaks frequently, it is likely that they are steering the conversation in some way. Be careful though of basing your ideas of conversational dominance purely around this though, as characters could just be answering lots of questions or making lots of small, relatively meaningless comments. Still, look down the left-hand side of a page or extract and see whose name appears the most. They could be dominating the conversation. Right, so there is some generic analysis done for you. I would be wary of basing an entire paragraph off just these ideas. You will still need quotations and language analysis, but this could be an interesting approach for you to take and may help you to make less obvious observations. So now that that is over, let's look at some quotations. So the first quotation I would like to look at with you comes shortly after the inspector has arrived. When Gerald and Eric challenge his authority and ask why they can't see the photograph of Eva, the inspector replies with, "It's the way I like to go to work. One person and one line of inquiry at a time. Otherwise, there's a muddle." I've selected this quotation as it makes it explicit that the inspector will control the proceedings of the investigation. Each sentence in his dialogue takes the form of a straightforward declarative sentence, which makes his ideas sound logical and also makes them slightly harder to disagree with, giving them power and authority. Furthermore, by using the conjunction otherwise, the inspector anticipates a likely counter-argument to his methods of investigation and then immediately discredits it by calling it a muddle, strengthening his authority as he seems like an experienced police inspector. You could even comment on the use of the first-person pronoun I, as the inspector is prioritizing himself. He is not interested in whether or not his methods inconvenience the Birlings or Gerald. He will do things his way, and it does not matter if they like it or not. Next up, we're going to look at an exchange held between Mr. Birling and the inspector. Here they are talking about the chief constable, Colonel Roberts, who would be the inspector's boss. The characters say, Mr. Birling: "Perhaps I ought to warn you that he is an old friend of mine, and that I see him fairly frequently. We play golf together sometimes up at the West Brumley." To which the inspector replies, dryly, "I don't play golf." In this exchange, there is an implied threat, which relates to power in a number of ways. When Mr. Birling tells the inspector that Colonel Roberts is his old friend, Mr. Birling is implying that he could have a word with him about Inspector Gould's conduct, which could result in him facing a punishment that could extend as far as him losing his job. This relates to the theme of power, as Mr. Birling is using his influence as a high-status and well-connected member of society to intimidate somebody else. What I think is particularly interesting, though, is that Mr. Birling is appealing to another character's power. It seems that Mr. Birling's authority has not influenced or swayed the inspector, and so he is instead trying to use another character's power to his benefit instead. In a roundabout way, by resorting to threatening to talk to Colonel Roberts about Gould, Mr. Birling is in fact conceding that the power that he personally has is not substantial enough in this case. However, the inspector's response to this threat is brilliant. He responds dryly, which means in an ironic and humorous way, which already suggests that he is not taking Mr. Birling's threat particularly seriously. By saying that he doesn't play golf, he is suggesting that he has no interest whatsoever in what Mr. Birling is saying. Essentially, he's seen Mr. Birling's threat and does not care. He has shrugged off the appeal to authority that Mr. Birling has attempted and seems to not care that he could get in trouble with his boss. In short, the inspector disregards power and authority in this quotation. Our third quotation comes from the inspector, who talks to Sheila. He says, "And so you used the power you had, as a daughter of a good customer, and also of a man well known in the town, to punish the girl just because she made you feel like that." In this quotation, power has been presented in an incredibly negative way. At Millwards, Sheila has power because she is the daughter of a good customer, and because her father is a man well known in the town, showing that power is intrinsically connected to a character's reputation. However, in this example, Sheila has misused and abused the power that she has, as she used it to punish Eva just because she felt jealous of her good looks. It is the verb punish in particular that shows that Sheila has abused her power. It has connotations of cruelty and suffering, which the inspector implies was totally unnecessary through his use of the word just, which in this case is an adverb that indicates that Sheila's reason for punishing Eva was small and insignificant. Not only does this quotation show that power can be misused, but it also suggests that it gives people an unjust sense of superiority. Sheila was only a customer at Millwards, and yet her sense of power made her think that she was in a position of superiority that meant that it was acceptable for her to lash out and punish Eva. Our fourth quotation also relates to the inspector. I'm hoping that you're starting to get the idea that the inspector is a particularly powerful character, and perhaps one that shows a more positive side of power. Rather than trying to punish the Birlings and Gerald, he is trying to show them the errors of their ways. Anyway, this quotation is less about what the inspector says and more about how he says it. The stage directions say, "massively taking charge." Now, variations of this stage direction appear a few different times across the play, and they make it pretty clear that the inspector is taking charge and bringing a sense of order to the chaos that is the squabbling of the Birlings and Gerald. This definitively presents the inspector as an authority figure, especially as he takes charge massively, since this adverb implies that he is in possession of complete control. Our fifth quotation about power comes from Mrs. Birling. She says, "You know, of course, that my husband was Lord Mayor only 2 years ago, and that he's still a magistrate." Much like Mr. Birling does on page 11, Mrs. Birling reminds other characters of her husband's former position of authority. In this example, she is directing this reminder at the inspector. This could be seen as another example of a character using power as a means of threatening another, as by reminding the inspector that Mr. Birling was Lord Mayor recently and still remains a magistrate, which is a role that is similar to that of a judge but deals with smaller offences. She is highlighting her husband's elevated social status, his connections, and his possible ability to get in contact with Inspector Gould's superiors. This therefore shows a character abusing power. It seems that Priestley is making the point that having power does not necessarily make you a good person. If I were to pick out a bit of language to really analyse in this quotation, it would be the phrase, "of course." This phrase implies that Mrs. Birling thinks that Mr. Birling's reputation and power are obvious, so much so that they must be respected. This could further suggest then that power makes people arrogant, showing yet another negative aspect of it. Building on from that, we have another quotation about power that relates to Mrs. Birling. The inspector says, "Was it owing to your influence, as the most prominent member of the committee, that help was refused the girl?" So I've already analysed this quotation in my video about social responsibility. So if I'm analysing it again, I guess that suggests that it is a fairly important quotation for you to know. With the theme of power in mind, there are two pieces of language that I would like to focus on. They are the noun influence and the hyperbolic phrase most prominent. By calling her the most prominent member of the committee, the inspector is essentially saying that Mrs. Birling is the most powerful person on it. In this position of power, Mrs. Birling has used her influence to ensure that Eva was denied support, a denial she insisted upon out of prejudice rather than any good reason. Again, power has been presented in a negative light. It is something that is used and abused and serves the interests of selfish individuals. It seems that Priestley really was trying to make a comment about how power was used in his time. An exchange held between Eric, Mr. Birling and the inspector gives us an insight into power too. They say, Eric, miserably, "Could I have a drink first?" Birling, explosively, "No!" Inspector, firmly, "Yes." As Birling looks like interrupting explosively, "I know. He's your son and this is your house. But look at him. He needs a drink now just to see him through." Now I have chosen this exchange because we see the interaction between two different kinds of power. When Mr. Birling explosively tells his son that he cannot have a drink with the imperative no, he is exerting what I am calling domestic power. Mr. Birling is attempting to use the power that he has as head of the household to control his son. Domestic power, which I would happily also call familial power or patriarchal power, in this example is shown to be controlling and somewhat unreasonable, given that Eric's request is pretty straightforward and inoffensive. However, the inspector contradicts Mr. Birling and firmly says that Eric may have a drink. The reason why the inspector allows this is because Eric needs a drink now just to see him through the rest of the evening and therefore the rest of the investigation. So here the inspector is exerting his professional power. This professional power overrides Mr. Birling's domestic power, as Eric does indeed eventually pour himself a drink, albeit with Mr. Birling's permission. So in terms of different types of power, it seems that the inspector's professional power is in fact more powerful than Mr. Birling's domestic power. Before we move on though, I think the inspector's dialogue, "I know, he's your son and this is your house, but look at him," is worth looking at explicitly. This dialogue shows the inspector acknowledging Mr. Birling's domestic power, showing a respect that we have not necessarily seen from a powerful character yet, meaning that power does not always make you an awful human being. Our penultimate quotation comes from the inspector, who, as the Birlings are bickering, says, taking charge masterfully, "Stop." They are suddenly quiet, staring at him. "And be quiet for a moment and listen to me." Now I think it's pretty obvious that the inspector is exerting his influence here. The stage directions, taking charge masterfully, make this pretty clear, but I don't think that they are a particularly useful stage direction to analyse, given that the language is fairly obvious. I guess you could argue that the adverb masterfully shows that not only does the inspector take control of the situation, but he does so in such a way that suggests he is used to commanding attention like this. You could even comment on the stage direction in the middle of the screen right now, which tells us that the Birlings, like a bunch of trained animals, stop, turn, and listen on command. Nope, instead we are going to look at the moods of the sentences that the inspector uses in his dialogue. Now, mood in this sense does not mean the atmosphere or if the sentences are happy or sad. It means something else, and if you want, I'll explain sentence moods more generally in their own video. If you want me to make that, let me know down in the comment section below. In this dialogue, though, the inspector exclusively uses imperative sentences. Imperatives are commands, and so linguistically, the inspector is exerting a lot of power in this dialogue, especially because his first utterance, stop, ends with an exclamation mark. I wonder, where else are imperatives used with great effect in this play? Maybe that could reveal something to you about power too. And our final quotation relating to the theme of power comes from Mr. Birling. It comes almost at the very end of the play, and he says, jovially, "But the whole thing's different now. Come, come, you can see that, can't you?" Imitating Inspector in his final speech. "You all helped to kill her." I've selected this quotation as I think it displays that Mr. Birling shows a complete disregard for the inspector's authority, or in other words, his power. I think this in particular because the stage direction states that Mr. Birling is imitating the inspector, and then goes on to repeat some of his parting words, which I feel pretty clearly shows Mr. Birling mocking Inspector Goole. It is significant that Mr. Birling says this at the play's end. It shows that, as much as the inspector has exerted his power over Mr. Birling and his family over the duration of the evening, Mr. Birling has not learned from this more powerful person in the slightest. As powerful as the inspector may have been, his teachings over the course of the evening were not totally successful. Some characters remain stuck in their selfish ways. It seems that no single person is able to set the Birlings and Gerald completely on the correct path. If you want to achieve the top grades in essays about this play, I think you need to consider J.B. Priestley's intentions. So when thinking about power, why did he make it a theme of the play? What message was he trying to put across? So I think that Priestley made power a reoccurring idea in his play so that he could condemn people who misuse their power. The Birlings and Gerald all have varying degrees of power, but certainly in comparison to Eva, they have a lot of it, and they use their power for their own personal interests at the expense of others, rather than for the greater good. This naturally portrays the Birlings and Gerald in a negative way, and so I think that Priestley is making a broader comment about people with power in his time. The majority of power was concentrated in a small corner of society, namely with upper-class capitalist men, and this would have been a factor in the perpetuation of the vast amount of inequality in this time. Inequality that was evident in class, gender and wealth. Being a socialist, Priestley would have championed equality and demonized those who made this all the more difficult, and so he would have wanted people, his audience, to see that those who were responsible for many of society's ills were also the very same people who were in charge of it. However, Priestley does not show power to be a wholly negative thing. The inspector is a powerful character who is shown in a positive light, although I guess this would be because he is a powerful socialist character. Despite the inspector's power though, we see at the end of the play that many of the characters have reverted back to their old selfish ways. The inspector did not provoke a permanent change in them. I wonder if this is Priestley's way of highlighting that no matter how powerful an individual may be, they cannot cause permanent change in others. Priestley may have been suggesting that societal change can only be properly and permanently implemented if a large group of people, like a government, try to make it happen. He could even be suggesting that people can only permanently change for the better if they choose to do it themselves. No amount of external influence can genuinely enforce this. So that is my discussion of the theme of power in An Inspector Calls done. But what could you do next? Well, if you're after some more quotations, you could think about who the most powerful character is in the play prior to the inspector's arrival, and how they choose to exert this power. You could specifically think about each of the Birlings and Gerald. How do they use and abuse their power in their dealings with Eva? I've already discussed Sheila and Mrs. Birling in this video, but what about the male characters? And finally, if you're really interested in getting the top grades, you might want to discuss how power is shown in relation to the play's minor characters. How is power shown in relation to Edna? What about Alderman McGarty? Could you even say something about Gerald's parents? Now, whether or not you choose to search for those extra quotations, please don't forget to like this video if it's helped you out. Leave a comment on it, either letting me know how useful this video has been, giving me some of your own analysis, or asking me a question. And of course, if you aren't already, you could subscribe to my channel too. But of course, whatever it is that you do choose to do, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. So there we go, that is how the theme of power is presented in J.B. Priestley's play. But which one quotation do you think is most important for you to know when thinking about this theme? Is it something I've covered in this video, or something I've suggested you look at in the extra quotations section, or something else entirely? Please do let me know down in the comment section below. Cheers.